All right. So our research is about conditional synthetic image generation for reducing algorithmic bias in imbalanced datasets, and we are part of Dr. Phil Muli's research group. So as a bit of an introduction to our research work, data bias in face datasets has caused many facial recognition algorithms to perform poorly on racial and gender subgroups. And research shows that face detection software from companies such as Amazon, Facebook, IBM, and Microsoft are biased against people of color and women. And there's up to a 34.4% difference between white males and Black females in terms of classification accuracy. And the most common cause for this bias is dataset imbalance. And there are current techniques that are used, such as oversampling and downsampling, that are aimed at restoring balance. But the ones that we are going to primarily be taking a look at are new synthetic generative techniques, such as variational autoencoders and generative adversarial networks, or VAEs and GANs for short, that have made and there have been recent strides in this field of research work for making new data based on previous data from a data set. And yeah.
So the data that we used for both the synthetic image generation for the VAEs and the GANs, as well as testing for a convolutional neural network that predicts gender to evaluator methods, was from the UTKFace dataset, which is essentially just a dataset of cropped and uncropped faces. If you take a look at the graph over there, this is the distribution of the different classes. And these two highest columns are the white faces, which were over 50% of the data set, while many of the other minority classes were around 5 to 10%, which is going to cause a lot of bias as the model gets more information on white faces than it would on other minorities.
Awesome. So as Pranav just mentioned, one of the most important techniques that we used in this research was the variational autoencoder, or the VAE. And so what we did with this network is we built an architecture that was trained with 3 important conditions, which are first the age, the gender, and the race. And what that means is that we can supply each of those conditions to the model, and based on its training and its fitting to the actual data, it's going to be able to generate a brand new face with those particular features that has no really resemblance to the exact original data, but instead is brand new and not a replica of the previous data. And the way this works is simply by using something known as latent vectors or latent variables. And so with the example of faces, if you just had a random set of 100 faces, there are a lot of quote unquote latent variables, which means that those are variables that are not explicitly defined. For instance, you have variables such as skin color or position of the head, or as well as race, which might not be explicitly defined in the picture of that particular person, but those are still variables that are changing from image to image. And what the variational autoencoder does is it compresses those images into latent vectors. And from those vectors, which are then transformed into a Gaussian distribution, can then be sampled from to create brand new images. And the way we use that is to create 8,410 brand new images of non-white faces with randomized gender and age. And what that did was it balanced the distribution that Mihika showed in the previous slide, and therefore allowed us to have an effective training, which ideally is going to be debiased because the data is much more balanced than it was before.
The second generative technology that we used were GANs, or generative adversarial networks. We used, this is sort of similar to VAEs, but different in the sense that it uses a generator and a discriminative neural network as a part of its architecture. The generator is a neural network that takes in random noise as an input and outputs an image as the output of a face with certain features. The discriminator is a neural network that distinguishes between real and fake images. Its whole job is to try to cross-check with the generated images of the GAN, and if the GAN is doing a good job, that means it can't really discriminate between the real and the fake images, and if the GAN is not doing a good job, it's able to very easily distinguish between the real and fake images presented by the GAN. For the GAN, we selected generated images with specific features vectors, matching the attributes of minority groups, and we sampled from them to generate another set of 8,400 images split evenly between male and female.
We ran multiple experiments to serve as a basis of comparison for our model. Firstly, we ran a baseline CNN that was trained with imbalanced data from the original dataset on a binary classification task, which in this case was gender classification. We trained this model with 5-fold cross-validation for 50 epochs. Another debiasing method that is very common with smaller datasets is random oversampling. In this method, the CNN is trained by duplicating images of minority groups. However, it doesn't always generalize well due to overfitting, which we'll notice later in the results. Another method is called the debiasing VAE network that learns latent representation of the dataset images and resamples based on this latent representation. What this basically means is that rarer faces, usually those that are part of the minority class, are resampled more. As seen in the images, a random batch from the original dataset shows more images from the majority class, which in this case are lighter faces, while a batch sampled from the actual DBVAE training data is more diverse.
Now, these are the results that we got from various tests with different data sets, where we trained these adjusted data sets on gender classification using the CNN. And so if you take a look at the graph in front of you, this is the accuracies for the imbalanced data, which was the original data that I showed previously with the 50% white faces. And so if you take a look at the first 5 columns on the left-hand side, these are all of the male classes, and they're all pretty even at first with a higher accuracy and a slight dip in the Asian. But as soon as we take a look at the right columns, these are all of the female classes, and they're significantly lower. And so this is the bias that we're trying to fix. These are the accuracies for the oversampling. And again, taking a look to the left-hand side, it's pretty even, it's pretty high. But as soon as we take a look at the right-hand side with the female classes, it's significantly lower than before, and it actually exacerbated the bias, which again, as Aadrij mentioned, happened because of overfitting, where the model saw only a certain set of images multiple times, and so it got too tuned to these images and couldn't recognize images that were outside of that data set. These are the results for the balance with VAE data set. And so this was one of our methods with the synthetic image generation that Joseph talked about. And if you take a look at the graph, it's pretty even all across the board. And the male columns and the female columns have high accuracies and have reduced the bias significantly compared to the original imbalanced data set. These are the accuracies for the data set that was balanced with the GANs, which is the method that Shikhar talked about. And so if you take a look at the left-hand side, again, males is pretty high, it's pretty even. If we take a look at the right-hand side with the female columns, again, it's pretty high, it's higher than before. There's a slight imbalance, but it's better than the imbalanced data performed. And then these are the accuracies for the DBVAE, which is the method that Aadrij was talking about. Overall, the bias did decrease, but the accuracy significantly dropped. And so this wasn't the optimal approach. And then this last comparison metric we used was standard deviation, which is essentially just measuring how big the difference in accuracy was for each of the different experiments with the different data sets. And so a higher standard deviation means that their accuracies were further apart, meaning there was more bias. And a lower standard deviation means there was less bias because the accuracies were closer together. And so if you take a look at the 2 bolded numbers, these are the results for the VAEs and the GANs, which are our methods, and they perform significantly better than the imbalanced data did, as well as the oversampling data set, which is what's most commonly used right now. And so overall, synthetic image generation performed better as a method for balancing data sets.
This research shows that using deep learning synthetic methods such as VAEs and GANs can be used to balance imbalanced facial datasets and improve performance on minority classes significantly. We see as much as a 32% increase in intra-class performance compared to modern methods. Our results are comparable with the top methods of today's research, such as DBVAE, and even better than other results such as other methods such as random oversampling and data augmentation. Our model also allows for the expansion of data set while avoiding the addition of noisy data that can confuse the model, which causes overfitting or underfitting. For future work, we would like to experiment with more complex networks such as VAE GANs, which basically combine the best aspects of both of these networks together, and compare our models to other balancing data set balancing networks such as balancing GANs. We would also like to use some sort of image enhancing to improve the quality and diversity of generated images, and unsupervised learning such as clustering to find the minority groups without actually labeling, without actually having data that is necessarily labeled. We'd also like to implement our model in other experiments such as multi-class classification to see if our model can generalize to other tasks.
There are references, and we'd also like to thank our advisor, Dr. Mui, and ASDRP for letting us do this research.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And any questions?
I have a question for the group. Can you describe any existing literature that is even close to the improvement that you have, or do you feel that this is the best improvements in the literature?
I can describe one. So as Aadrij mentioned earlier, one of them was the DBVAE, and that model was actually originally trained on the Celeb A dataset, which is a dataset of around 200,000 images of celebrities. And that actually performance was really a landmark result because there were tons of images in that data set, and using the resampling technique that that model actually had, it was able to be very successful. But the main difference here is that that research had hundreds of thousands of images, where in this case, we only have around 5,000 images. And that method, which is a DBVAE, relies on having lots of images to train that latent representation, where our actual approach here doesn't rely on that many images because it's completely unsupervised and just goes for many hours just creating new images. So we think that that part's a little bit more novel and unique, but their method is very effective as well with the case of having many images too.
Yeah, so in my opinion, what you have presented is incredibly novel. And in fact, it surprised me on the performance that you're able to get for such a small data set. So really great job, everybody.
Thank you so much.